I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a return visit by the author of this book, which she tells me it's in her fifth printing. This is almost like any textbook status. There's somebody out there fed up. It's Dan DiMartino Booth, who was the former right-hand woman to Richard Fisher, former Dallas Fed president. Danielle, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
It is great to be here, Greg.
I wanted to get right off with what's going on with the Fed and interest rates. We have an upcoming FOMC meeting, the last of the year. Everybody thinks it's baked into the cake, a quarter of a point. You said they were going to raise rates, that they were going to keep, and you were correct. What's your outlook now? What are your sources saying? What's your gut saying? What's going on with the interest rates?
Well, I think that this upcoming week's FOMC meeting is a shoo-in. I don't think that Powell has it in him to even begin to disturb the financial markets, and I don't think he wants to look like he's kowtowing to Trump's criticism. So I think that we will definitely get this next 25 basis point, quarter percentage point rate hike that takes the Fed funds rate, the overnight lending rate, to 2.5%. Savers will rejoice. The big question now on markets' minds is what happens in 2019 if signs that the economy is slowing as well as global growth signals continue to weaken. What does the Fed do in 2019? I think that is where markets are turning their attention right now.
Well, what's your outlook then for 2019? A lot of I mean, I know you're the former right-hand person, the top Fed, to the top Fed official, Richard Fisher, who lovingly said that we've injected the markets with cocaine and heroin. That was in the beginning of 2016, and of course, everybody on CNBC just went, ooh.
Did you say that?
But yeah, did he say that? Of course, that wasn't a big news story. But anyway, but I know you talked to him, and I know there's this big. A lot of people like Donald Trump say don't raise rates. The Fed's killing us and killing the economy. And other people like Powell and I think your former boss are all saying raise rates, raise rates. We got to raise rates. What's going on with this back and forth with this push and pull? Can you tell me what you think and what your former boss thinks? Maybe we'll start there.
I think Richard and I are on the same page when it comes to the need for the Fed to have ammunition to fight the next war. It's pretty difficult to go onto the front lines with your chamber half empty, and that's effectively what we have. Normally, when we go into recession, if you look back into prior cycles, the Fed has 4.5 or 5 percentage points of interest rates that they can then reduce in order to combat recession, make monetary policy easier, make it easier to borrow and spend. And that is not the case this time. If we, after this coming week's rate hike, we'll be at 2.5%. So look at us as being halfway there, and that helps you start to understand why some of the people who are more hawkish, like Jay Powell, like Richard Fisher, see that it is so essential that we get rates higher. Because again, I don't know that either of them, I'm certainly not convinced that money printing necessarily works. We have exploding deficits in this country, and optically speaking, there is a real danger that there's going to be people saying, you know what, the Fed is outright monetizing the debt if we have to launch quantitative easing again. But we don't have very many options, Greg, as long as we've only got 2.5 percentage points of rates that we can then reduce.
What the fear is, and I was just going to take the other side of the argument that I'm not that I'm on that side, but I just said, but the other side of the argument is the fear is you're killing the economy. I mean, John Williams, not the Fed guy, John Williams in San Francisco, but John Williams at shadowstats.com says we do have a pretty good little upswing in the economy, but the Fed's raising rates and they're killing it off. What about the idea? Can they raise rates too much and kill the economy and send it into the recession they fear and they want to have higher interest rates to fight with? Can they kill the economy by raising rates?
They can, and there is something that we learn on the first day inside of the Fed. Not that I recommend you join the Fed just to learn, so I'll just tell you what it is. But we learned about something called a lagged effect. And what a lagged effect means is that if I raise interest rates today, the economy is not really going to feel the full effects of that rate increase until 9 or 12 months from now. So what that means is that all of the rate hikes that have been deployed over the last 12 months are just now setting in and deterring economic growth. But if you look back, even as early as April, May, we were already seeing the most leading of all sectors of the economy, that would be residential housing. We've already seen that slowing now for 10 straight months. So I would argue that not only can the Fed arrest the economic expansion, but that it is already being arrested, and that is the problem that Jay Powell has on his hands, is that Janet Yellen left him with this legacy because she was petrified to increase interest rates at the pace that she should have when the economy was stronger, and didn't. So he's in between, in Jay Powell's defense, he is in between a rock and a hard place, because we can very easily slide into recession from here if the Fed keeps raising interest rates, and yet his predecessors left him in a very precarious position.
So what do you think he's going to end up doing? Is there a possibility that he may just throw in the towel, in early 19 when, oh man, the numbers are terrible, man, we are tanking. I mean,
you never know. We could easily see a very sharp decline in the first quarter in economic output. We've had a lot of companies, a lot of firms, what we call panic buying in front of the potential raising of tariffs on Chinese goods from 10 to 25%. So we had a lot of supply pulled forward. Now, if there's not demand on the other end of that for this tremendous inventory restocking cycle that we've just gone through, then companies are going to slam on the brakes and stop buying in the first quarter, and that could really be detrimental to economic health. And to answer your question, would Jay Powell, and has Jay Powell said in no uncertain terms, I will follow the data? That is what he said. I believe that if he sees the real economy slowing, that he will indeed pause in this tightening campaign in early 2019.
What's that going to do to inflation, to gold, to commodities? If everybody smells blood in the water and goes, uh-oh, Fed's overextended, they're going to stop raising rates. Does that mean we get big inflation and big spikes in gold, which the Fed hates, which a lot of people read my site like? But are they going to get a pause and everybody is going to smell blood in the water?
Well, I certainly think that Powell's recent speech that he gave in New York, where he alluded to pausing for the first time in his career, definitely sent shockwaves. It sent gold up. It didn't send inflation up, though. And I think what your viewers need to appreciate, and they'll like this, is that gold actually has appreciated in value. It has gone up in value during deflationary times as well as inflationary times over the past 30 years. The rule book when it comes to how gold behaves has been thrown out because governments around the world have built up as much debt as they have. For every dollar of debt this country has, it has to be serviced. And that means that for every dollar that goes to interest, for every pennies on the dollar that goes to servicing that debt, there are fewer left to buy other goods and services. And that is why people have such a hard time wrapping their head around why we've had deflation, when all of this money printing should, in theory, the textbooks tell us, be inflationary. But don't get me wrong, gold is outperformed under both scenarios.
And then what do you make of this? And I'm just going to hold it up for you. It's a zero hedge title, and it's Fed net worth turns negative following a record $66 billion in paper losses. So we're talking, in effect, they're talking about this $4.1 billion they have on their books. Rates have gone up, so they've lost money. They've only got $39 billion in capital. But the end of the story says, oh well, they can print money. But so I mean, the Fed's not going to go out of business. But what is your appraisal of a headline? This, I mean, being a negative and having $39 billion in capital and having a $66 billion loss means you're insolvent. But what do you say? I mean, the Fed's never going to be insolvent because they can print money. But go ahead. What do you say about this?
Well, first and foremost, the Fed's never going to be insolvent because it can hold those treasuries and mortgage-backed securities to maturity such that they get 100 cents on the dollar. So what they have right now, what they've racked up, is paper losses. They don't have to actually recognize them, which is why there's no technical loss for the Fed. That being said, Fed detractors were all over this story, and I would bring to your attention optically how very bad and damning this looks for people who would like to audit the Fed, who would like to rein in the Fed's authority, because they can trump out headlines like this and say, you're running at a loss, you're an insolvent financial institution. On planet Earth, if you didn't have your own special set of accounting rules that you had to abide by, you would have long since gone out of business. So I'm not worried about the Fed's survival per se, but people have come out since this story's hit the wires and said that it is not good optically and that it gives enemies of the Fed ammunition to go after them.
Well, there's a lot of people that say we don't need the Fed. Actually, it's a set of private bankers. There's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. You know that. It's a bunch of private bankers.
It is not a bunch of private bankers, Greg. That is a myth, and it is the worst myth, and it is the worst myth that you can propagate. My email address when I was at the Fed used to end with .org. The people at the Fed in Washington, D.C., their email addresses end with .gov, and every penny of profit that the district banks make has to be sent right back to the Treasury. That is the law. So I get irritated with the conspiracy theorists who think that this is just a bunch of private bankers, because that is not the case. Any money that is made, any profits that are made, actual hard cash, must be remitted right back to you and me, aka Uncle Sam.
I mean, we don't get to know the owners of the Fed, right? I mean, isn't like JP Morgan and all these banks, the owners of the Fed, primary dealers of Treasury? Don't we get to know? We don't get to know the owners, right? I mean, so why?
Get to know the owners. It's called Jamie Dimon, who's the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan. And what JP Morgan and other banks have is access to lending by the Fed. They have access to what we call the discount window, but they do not own the Fed. The Fed is owned by we, the people.
The Fed is owned by we, the people. That's a big statement.
The Fed is definitely controlled and highly influenced by the bankers that populate the boards of directors all throughout the country. But just like any other board of directors, they have to have independent members of the board that have absolutely nothing to do with the banking industry. So look, think about it this way. Would you rather have bankers input in terms of how the financial system, how the banking system is faring, or would you rather have somebody who's working, say, in the supermarket industry? You need to have a good feel for the health of the financial system. You get that reconnaissance, by the way, by law. If you have access to the discount window, if you're one of the 17, 19 primary dealers, you by law have to provide markets reconnaissance and economics reconnaissance in exchange for that privilege to have access to the Fed, to the people who write up the briefings.
But a lot of people say we should audit the Fed, and if you audit the Fed, they die. The whole thing's a scam. That's what people say. They say you should audit the Fed, but we've never audited the Fed.
We've got politicians in all the wrong nooks and crannies in this country. The last place we need a politician is the Fed. What we need at the Fed are more people like Jay Powell, who are truly independent and are not going to kowtow to politics. I have found it to be infuriating, Greg. I hope you're with me on this. But they're saying that the Fed is now entering a period of being a politicized institution. I throw back to these critics the question, how on earth do you think for the last 30 years we've had the stealthiest, biggest expansion of the social safety net that's not been free, had the Fed not been political in the first place and held interest rates at the zero bound for political ends in the first place? Look, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Alan Greenspan, much more political individuals than Jay Powell. I think the media's got this one completely backwards.
Do you think that we could do without the Fed? I mean, the Constitution provides that the Treasury can print money. I mean, we actually do have coins, quarter dollars that are Treasury instruments.
We have all those things, and we also have the Chinese who want to eat our lunch. And we've already dealt with the Chinese on so many different levels of cyber theft that I would rue the day that we didn't have somebody watching over our financial system, making sure that the Chinese weren't just moving in. We need it as a backstop. It's a national security issue. The fact that the Fed needs to be audited needs to go away, and we do that by people who running the Fed being completely independent of the politicians, and that takes the heat away from the need to audit the Fed in the first place. In a million years, I do not want the Chinese to be in charge of my financial system because we decide to let the Fed go away and open the gates of hell to cyber terrorists from China. No, thank you.
But transparency is a good thing. I mean, the president just had.
Transparency is perfect.
So why wouldn't you have? And I'm not trying to argue with you, but why wouldn't you have an audit of the Fed? I mean, it's we the people. It's us. I'm a journalist, so I'm all for transparency. So I'm saying more transparency is better than less. I mean, why wouldn't you audit the Fed, though? I mean, a lot of people are calling for that. I would say, yeah, I'd like to see what's going on. Why wouldn't you want to do that?
I would have liked I knew what was going on inside the Fed, so I didn't necessarily need to audit it personally, but I could certainly see how a citizen of this country would want to know what's been going on behind closed doors for the past 30 years that it's been so beneficial to Wall Street fat cats, that it has been so beneficial to the banking system and politicians in Washington. Again, if you open yourself up to making political decisions as an institution, then you by rights should open yourself up to being audited.
But an audit you're against an audit. So I would be for an audit.
Audit. I'm against. What I prefer is for there to be no need for an audit. I'm agreeing with you, Greg. There has been a need to audit the Fed for decades now. Decades. I would prefer that they act independently and stick to their mandates and nothing more. The mission creep has been terrible. It is the mission creep at the Fed that has opened the gates of criticism to them. I think that if they behaved more objectively and independently and just looked after the buying power of the US dollar that is in your wallet and mine, that they would close the doors to criticism overnight. But they're not there yet.
Speaking of the direct buying power, would the buying power of the dollar take a hit if the world's a mess. The European Central Bank is stopping QE, stopping bond buying. All these different countries have their own Trump-like figure in them, and Trump ideas, which is not a bad thing. Orban, Salvini in Italy and Hungary, the riots in France, and it's not over a gas tax. Brexit, Theresa May looks like a stooge of the EU. Then there's Donald Trump, who I happen to like, and he's not perfect, but he is sure mixing it up and fighting. What are the risks with this kind of a political environment in the Western world?
Well, the last time we saw this level of blanket populism that spanned the entire globe and all of the developed economies, that was during the 1920s, during the Gilded Age, when inequality was at a similar level as where it is today, when economic opportunity for hardworking citizens of countries was simply not there. There is a very good, solid economic reason for the rise of nationalism, for the rise of populism in the world, and it has to do with economic inequality. So I understand why these politicians have become so very popular. I understand how very economically debilitating the immigration crisis in Europe has been. And I don't look at it as a political thing. I look at it as every single individual from another country that lands on European shores has to be taken care of. And that is very, very, very expensive. This is something that we looked at a decade ago and asked, what are the ramifications going to be of the building immigration crisis economically on the continent of Europe? And we're finding out what those ramifications and the backlash is today, because it's taking away from economic opportunity from people born in those countries.
Do you think that Europe, they were trying to, do you think Europe's problems could take the entire European Union down? I mean, you have Deutsche Bank, which William Black was on, saying that this is just a criminal operation. Now they want to merge it to Commerzbank in Germany, which is, all the derivatives and all the debt and all the crime and fraud and, all that. I mean, could the European Union and any of these countries, France, Italy, the Brexit, the bank situation, could any of this take down the whole world economy?
Well, you have to look at the numbers, Greg. China is the largest exporter in the world, followed by the United States, followed by Germany. So if you're asking me if the third largest exporting nation in the world could take the global economy down with it, the answer is absolutely yes. And what makes it more difficult is that they're sitting on a pile of dry gunpowder that has been created by Mario Draghi, buying back bonds at a rate that, I mean, if you can believe the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was $4.5 trillion at its peak. It was about 25% of US GDP at its peak. The ECB's, the European Central Bank's balance sheet is 5.3 trillion. It will grow through the end of this year. They have negative interest rates, and it looks like they could possibly go into recession. The entire European area could go into recession with negative interest rates. Textbooks don't exist to explain this type of environment at all. And if you want to take this back to how angry the people are, they're going to be really angry once they go into recession. Will
this take down the entire world economy? Let's say that, I mean, we have so much debt out there. I mean, it's just you brought up the fact, or maybe it was
250 trillion.
There you go. You brought that up. That we went from 165 trillion in '08, somewhere in that neighborhood. It's a stunning amount of money, and to 250 trillion dollars in debt. You don't need a big recession for this to blow up, do you?
You don't need a lot to let the credit genie out of her bottle. And when you're looking at some $8.6 trillion of debt globally being at a negative interest rate, that means that your runway is very, very short. You could set off a bomb, whether it be in the European banking system, which never cleaned up to the same extent as American banks. The financial system is as interconnected today as it was. You brought up the issue of derivatives. We don't know how risk would play out, but we know that we're connected enough as a global financial system for a hiccup in one country to have global ramifications. Absolutely.
What's your biggest fear for 2019? What's your forecast, fear, whatever it is? Obviously, you don't think things are going swimmingly.
I don't think things are going swimmingly. I look at countries like I wrote my weekly newsletter on the country of Australia that's been in a recovery for nearly 28 years. Well, if you dig deeper, the reason that they've been as healthy as they are is twofold. One, you'll like a lot. Their central bankers are more prudent than most central bankers around the world. They never took interest rates to the zero bound. They never screwed savers like what happened in the United States and what happened in Europe and what's happened in Japan, of course. But they've also had a huge economy. They're now the 11th largest in the world, grow on the back of Chinese expansion. And my greatest fear right now, and the reason I think we haven't seen the trade war between the United States and China tick up to the extent that it could, goes to my fear that China can't afford to fight a real war on all fronts. That's my fear, Greg, because China's been floating the global economy for a very long time, building up its cities, its export engines. Look at what's happening in Germany. It looks like Germany might go into contraction by the end of this year. The German economy contracted in the third quarter because of the upset and disruption in the Chinese economy. It looks like they could contract in the fourth quarter as well, which is a conventional, true, formal definition of recession. My fear is much more based in China, as well as a United States economy that is clearly slowing at this point.
Do you think that could knock the whole world into a dramatic debt depression? I mean, with $250 trillion in debt, I mean, you don't need a big mess up for this daisy chain to unhook, do you?
You theoretically do not. I mean, I can't say where the risk lies. I knew that when Lehman Brothers was allowed to go, and if you can imagine, let me put things in perspective, because we throw around $250 trillion like it's chump change, and people have a hard time contextualizing how much money we're talking about these days. You and I were both around in 1998 when long-term capital management was bailed out, and Alan Greenspan led bankers, and a whole bunch of them got in a room and they wrote checks to bail out long-term capital management. Can you imagine what that bailout costs?
I think it was about $4 trillion.
$3 billion.
Oh, $3 billion. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Billion with a B.
$3 billion. What would it cost today?
Well, that's the thing. We've lost our perspective. AIG, the AIG bailout was $85 billion. And by the time we got to 2017 and people grew completely immune to dollar signs and how many zeros were behind the commas, we were printing globally $2.12 trillion in the year 2017. That is changing. The European Central Bank had a meeting last week, and Mario Draghi, as fearful as he is also going to be leaving and heading back to Rome just when the peanut butter hits the fan next year. He's going to be leaving his post, leaving it to somebody else. Does that sound familiar? But they are going to stop expanding their balance sheet. They're the only buyer of Italian debt. Italy's got the third largest sovereign bond market in the world. There are a lot of things that can go wrong, just like what happened in 2007, 2008, 2009, when the liquidity dries up. And that is something I think too few people understand. And they say to me, well, Danielle, the U.S. stock market's done really well this year compared to the rest of the world. A Deutsche Bank study showed that 90% of assets in the world had negative returns in 2018. So why did the U.S. stock market escape such a fate? Well, I've got two words for you: share buybacks, liquidity. It all comes down to liquidity. If there's one thing that I could convey, it would be that if companies like General Electric are going to run into issues and have their bonds trade down into junk territory, even though they're technically rated investment grade, if we see more of these going into 2018, these are problems that cannot be resolved easily and neatly, not when, as you point out, you're dealing with the level of debt that you have in the world economy percolating around today. You don't know where the risk is going to land.
Aren't we going to have, now that we're on this conversation with the ECB, stopping buying, printing money to buy bonds, buying debt, aren't we going to have one ginormous debt default, a daisy chain of debt default? Am I wrong? Could we have a daisy chain of debt default?
I don't think that we see anything of that magnitude, mainly because people who believe that they can continue to print money to kingdom come are still in positions of authority. If there's one theory that is bandied about, it is that on the other side of the next global recession, financial crisis, call it what you will, that we will have a debt jubilee. And that is when I think that you really start to see things unravel on a global basis. It's not going to happen overnight necessarily, but I think that getting all countries involved, and I think there's geopolitical uncertainty out there. I think that there are definitely rivalries and that there are alliances that are being made with countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the Chinese, just to bring up one alliance. So I'm not so sure that something like a debt jubilee, where all countries in the world are supposed to hold hands, sing kumbaya, and forgive debt, I don't know that that scenario necessarily unfolds.
So you don't think we'll have the debt won't be forgiven willingly? I mean, won't people just have to say, we can't pay, sorry? I mean, are we headed for a Puerto Rico moment where they say, sorry, we can't pay?
The debt will not be forgiven willingly. The reason we have not seen a messier escalation with China is because they're sitting on over $1 trillion of U.S. treasuries. They're the largest holder of U.S. treasuries in the world, and they don't have the political wherewithal. They don't have the cash on hand to truly play hardball, which would entail selling our treasuries. And that would do serious damage to the country. But again, China's not in as strong of a position as they would like for you to believe.
So you think the trade war is going to be won by Trump? I mean, this Huawei CEO up in Canada, I mean, they're playing tit for tat now. The Chinese have arrested, Canadians, as they're saying that they're going to be reprisals on Canada. Trump saying he may get involved. I mean, so you're saying this trade war is not going to be resolved in China's favor?
I think that there will be continued compromise on the part of the Chinese because they continue to need the rest of the world, not necessarily the United States, but they need the rest of the world as much as they can. Well, let me put it differently. They cannot afford to lose the trade war. They have to compromise. And I think that that's what we're starting to see. It was supposed to be a Department of Justice event, and the Huawei arrest was supposed to be separate, and the investigation had been going on for a long time. And there are all kinds of political maneuverings around this. But at the end of the day, any type of escalation is going to raise the heat, and people need to realize that February is just a moment away, and that is the next deadline that Trump has extended to the Chinese. I suspect that for the good of the Chinese economy, and given the fact that its debt to GDP is over 300%, so it is in a very tenuous, vulnerable position with its own debt load, I would suspect that the Chinese will be forced to compromise. The question is, how do we enforce it? How do we truly see whether or not they're no longer thieves?
With the theft of intellectual property, IP, right?
Yes, that is what I'm referring to, but it's
theft.
Theft is theft.
Yeah, theft is theft. And they still want to keep on stealing. Their trade deals is, we want to keep on stealing. What? New sheriff in town? No. So, what about all this geopolitical stuff here in the United States? I mean, we have, Huber testifying in Congress. You have Comey not remembering anything 260 times or something. You've got Loretta Lynch. I mean, there's a failed coup that happened. They tried to knock Donald Trump out of the box, and they failed. And it was the prior administration, and some people say it's all the way up to Obama. What about if people start going to jail for this coup? What happens if we start getting arrests? You know, the Gitmo thing, all the indictments. I heard on Hannity, Sarah Carter talk about there's a lot of sealed indictments, and they're going to be coming out soon. I mean, that's starting to bubble out in the mainstream media. What happens if people have to pay for this failed coup?
You know, Greg, I'm going to step back for just a minute and say that if there's one thing in recent weeks that really was alarming to me, it was the press conference that occurred with Trump and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. And it was something that you might have seen on Thailand TV, maybe in a different parliament in an emerging market. But you don't normally see such open animosity here in the United States politics. We try and be a little bit more genteel. My fear is that the more things escalate here at home with the Democrats in charge of the House, simply that it is going to become a really ugly, violent tit for tat, and that the public is going to become consumed with trying to track who hates who the most, who's going to jail, where's the perp walk coming from. I worry about people who have the authority to subpoena willy-nilly, and simply what we are conveying to our children about decorum and democracy and compromise, because it is getting really ugly. You make it to where you just don't want to turn the news on, or at least let your children watch the news at night anymore.
You're saying that the geopolitical spectrum, no matter who are you, or Democrat or Republican, and
doesn't matter where you are.
No matter where you are, you're saying this is very destabilizing to the economy. Will you talk about that?
Destabilizing to the economy, and it is extremely debilitating to the long-term superpower potential of the United States. If there's one thing that we're doing that's shooting ourselves in the foot, it is not coming together as a country, because we have plenty of enemies out there who no longer have the same copacetic relationships with us that we used to. We're becoming energy independent, which is wonderful, but that also means that people who used to potentially be friendly and allies of the United States no longer feel that they need to be. Again, China has a very large economy, and I worry when I start to see divisions, not just taking our country, ripping our country apart at the seams, but I worry when we have global divisions, because we haven't seen anything like this in our lifetimes. We just lost President H.W. Bush. He was kind of the last generation of people who can tell you how dangerous it is when national divisions become global divisions, and when currency wars and economic warfare turns into something much different. It's not something I think we expect. And everybody says it will only be carried out in the internet, and it will only be cyber this and cyber that. I'm not so sure, Greg.
2019, good year, rough year. Just give us your appraisal of 2019. We'll wrap it up there.
Well, in 2018, we had liquidity pulled from the financial system. We went from a $2 trillion run rate to basically flatlining. We know that that number is going to turn net negative. Again, I look at the world in very simple fashion, simple prism, less liquidity, more volatility. It's simply how it works.
Danielle DiMartino Booth, I didn't bring this up at the very beginning, but your website is Quill, Q-U-I-L-L, intelligence.com. QuillIntelligence.com. There's free stuff on the homepage. You also have the Daily Feather, which is somewhere where you write your take on things. I think, what is that, $25? Talk about your website. Talk about what you do.
So the success of the book Fed Up made it to where I decided right after Memorial Day to launch a product that any American has access to. It's $25 a month. It has taken off like gangbusters, and it is simply a continuation of what the intent of Fed Up was to do, and that was to distill all the gobbledygook that economists and people on Wall Street would like to confuse you with. It is simply an extension and a continuation of the financial literacy mission that I am on, and it has done exceedingly well. I'm very, very proud of it, and I'm happy to bring people in every single day so that we know more than they do.
I just wanted to bring up, too, because we had this discussion about the Fed. Your book was very highly critical of the Fed. This was not a love fest with the Fed. This
was not a love fest, no.
You were pretty brutal on the Fed in this book. So anybody that says, oh, she's just a Fed lover, well, not so much. Not so much. But
after Fed Up, it tells you that I don't want to end the Fed, but I almost want to do. I want to take it down to the studs and build it from the ground up. Its institution is broken.
Yeah, you're highly highly critical. I mean, your boss, Richard Fisher, came out, and I've said this before, but, came out in beginning of 2016 on CNBC and, said that we've injected the economy with heroin and cocaine, which wasn't, he was being, cavalier there, but he was being very critical of what the Fed had done. Of course, you stay in contact with it. But listen, the website, quillintelligence.com, I'll put the links up. Your daily feather with for $25 a month is there. Thank you. You are the author of the book, 5th printing, and this thing is, you're going to get a 6th printing. It looks like you're going to get it out of there. But anyway, Danielle DiMartino Booth, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com. That was fun.